A few days ago, we finally got the first gameplay demonstration for the Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, about 10 whole minutes of footage. And from this footage, a lot of debate and discussion has sparked about this game. Many different types of debates. Is this game too samey? Does it feel just like DLC? Is the game a visual leap over Breath of the Wild, or just about the same? Should they have waited for Nintendo Switch 2? Are there enough changes in this game? And I think a lot of this conversation, not all of it, but a lot of this conversation boils down to this question I have as the main topic for this video. Is Tears of the Kingdom technically impressive or disappointing? And that's what we're talking about today.
Hey, listen!
Welcome everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we're talking about just how impressive Tears of the Kingdom is from a technical perspective. But before we jump into things, let me first point out that we are aiming to hit 25,000 subscribers by the time Tears of the Kingdom comes out on May 12th. If you enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit that notification bell, because if you do, we might just make it. So before I go further, let me explain what I mean by technically impressive. And there's a few different elements. One is the graphics. How visually pleasing is the game? What sort of effects are going on? How is the overall world? Is there a good draw distance? Can we see far off into the distance? And as we progress and travel throughout the world, do things pop in obviously when they're loaded in? Or do they come in more subtly in a natural way that facilitate our immersion into the game? And then alongside having a world with cool effects that are visually pleasing, it needs to run well. Do we have a stable frame rate, or are there areas where it gets kind of choppy? That factors into how impressive I think this game could be. But then going beyond graphics and performance, there's also the gameplay mechanics. I think that should be factored in as well, because some of these systems in place can be demanding and they can facilitate a quality experience with the game. Think about this. Breath of the Wild. Yes, there were some frame rate issues. Yes, it's for the Nintendo Switch. This entire game is for the Switch, right? So we are talking about Switch standards here. But with Breath of the Wild, it had some of the most impressive physics and mechanics we had seen in any game ever. And those mechanics helped the world to feel more interactive. It helped to support this living, breathing world. It felt organic, immersive. And when you think about it, in part, that's why we care so much about graphics and performance, because that helps to immerse ourselves into the world, to make it feel more believable or fun to look at and play. The gameplay mechanics that facilitate a living, breathing world that we can interact with play a vital role into how technically impressive a game can be. And I think, especially with Tears of the Kingdom, with all the new gameplay mechanics we're seeing so far, and what else there might be, this plays perhaps an even more significant role to how technically impressive or disappointing this game's gonna be. So with that in mind, I think we can now start to look at some elements we've seen in this game and start to sort of debate whether it's impressive or not. And it should be noted that this may not be the final build of the game. We don't have the final version at home on our TVs or running on our Switches in handheld mode. So what we're seeing here may be a little misleading. And that actually brings me to my first big point here. Because one of the things I noticed about Tears of the Kingdom, and if you follow my channel, you know I'm a big fan of Tears of the Kingdom, right? I am not trying to speak ill for Tears of the Kingdom. I'm actually making this video to support Tears of the Kingdom, but I'm going to be honest. Seeing Tears of the Kingdom at first, visually, I was a little bit let down. But let me explain. It's not because I don't think there are some impressive things going on that look amazing. That is all there. And I think when you really break it down, as I will in this video, it is almost mind-boggling impressive. But from a resolution perspective, from a sharpness perspective, from a texture detail perspective, I am questioning just how impressive Tears of the Kingdom is, because in some ways, it looks worse than Breath of the Wild. I've been playing Breath of the Wild recently, in part to gather some gameplay to make videos about Zelda, and I'm editing these videos. I'm looking at these trailers, I'm breaking them down frame by frame, I'm looking at Tears of the Kingdom footage, and what I'm noticing is that Tears of the Kingdom, at least from the gameplay demonstration, looks blurrier, looks less detailed. But is that because the actual game is less detailed? I'm not so sure, because when we take a look at the Tears of the Kingdom trailers, when we take a look at the press release screenshots for Tears of the Kingdom, even from this gameplay demonstration, we can see that the press screenshots look really sharp. They look impressive, I would say, next to the stills we have from the gameplay that we got on YouTube. And so it leads me to question, is this a product of poor compression that's ruining how good this game is actually going to look? And when we actually have the game in our hands, we're going to see just how impressive it is? Or is this a case of Nintendo showing us the ideal version of Tears of the Kingdom through the trailers and the screenshots running on a PC somewhere? We don't know that for a fact. I'll say that I feel that Nintendo in general does represent their games accurately, so I'm going to err on the side of optimism here and say that the blurriness I'm seeing has a lot to do with compression, and perhaps Nintendo just didn't do a great job of presenting Tears of the Kingdom in this format. But we'll see once we actually get our hands on the game, or at least more footage down the road. But going beyond this possible compression issue, I think there's a lot here that is impressive. I think the Sky Islands look pretty great. Seeing the different blades and the trees and the new constructs, they all look pretty cool. They all look visually pleasing. The visuals look kind of like Breath of the Wild, just different locales, and playing Breath of the Wild, I'll say it still looks pretty good. I think what I'm basically saying here is that assuming that it is just a compression issue, this game basically looks just like Breath of the Wild on Switch, which is not a bad thing. However, I want to say, and I can't say this with certainty, but from what we've seen so far, it almost looks like the lighting and shadows and the Sky Islands look perhaps a bit more impressive. It may just be the case that they're a little bit more noticeable with the yellow color hues and such, but it looks pretty good. And then when Link is finally knocked off the island and we see him flying down, and we can see the entire world of Hyrule from that angle, it's impressive, despite the possible compression issues. The draw distance here is just staggering. And this is something where it's very clearly a massive improvement over Breath of the Wild. You can never see so far off into the distance with this level of detail. And it makes sense, considering that the scope of Tears of the Kingdom is far greater than Breath of the Wild because of the Sky Islands and potentially more that's unconfirmed. They had to probably figure something out to render this much more terrain and objects and things going on in the world in a way that feels natural. And looking at how seamless the transition is from the sky to the surface, that makes me feel pretty good about this game. But that also brings me to another element here, and that is the abilities, because they start off the footage on the surface, and while there's definitely some debate if the game feels too samey or not, I think it's just a lot of subtle details that we'll realize how much differences there actually are later on when we actually play Tears of the Kingdom. But when they get to using the recall ability, when Aonuma does that, we see straight up time reversal for an object in the terrain being taken out, changing the overall world of Tears of the Kingdom and rising up into the sky in a fairly seamless way. That's also pretty darn cool. Having that kind of gameplay mechanic, being able to do that, is impressive. There aren't many games where you can just fly up like that high in a very stable, normal way. This is something that I think is being slept on by many. When you consider the way we can transition between the surface and the sky and back down, that alone says a lot about how technically impressive this game is. But it goes beyond that, I would say, because there are the other abilities. There's the Ultra Hand, and we can build these different things, and these things aren't just some random items. If you look at this particular shot here, you'll notice that there are some significant chunks of island that are highlighted in orange. What this means is that those items, those giant land masses in the distance, we can control and maneuver, further supporting this idea that the world is highly interactive and we can change a lot about it. Which, by the way, there is quite a bit of speculation that I think is fairly supported that this world in Tears of the Kingdom, as Aonuma refers to as an unknown Hyrule, is very interactive. There's a lot we can change. We already remarked on how we can use recall to move around some of these structures or land masses that are embedded into the ground of Hyrule that are randomly falling from the sky, by the way, so there is a lot of change there. But when we take a look at the end of the demonstration, we see Link next to some pieces of foundation for potential houses. So when you consider that at the end of Breath of the Wild, Zelda talks about how they're going to make an effort to restore Hyrule, perhaps even beyond. And now we have this insane building ability that can build so many different things, and we see that throughout the surface of Hyrule there is this restoration effort. And also, they had ideas to go beyond just a Terry Town quest in Breath of the Wild, which is where you built an entire town. It may have been something more significant. Maybe there's going to be a lot of changes that we will be responsible for throughout the world of Hyrule this time around. And I think that's something else that should be considered, just how interactive this world is going to be, and we're seeing some strong evidence of a very highly interactive world. The comparisons have been made that this game is kind of like Minecraft, which may not be exciting to some people who want to play more of a traditional Zelda game, but when you consider that this is a open world Zelda game that has some Minecraft qualities, that's kind of mind-blowing, because Minecraft is intentionally simple because of what it's doing, having this highly interactive world that you can change around almost entirely freely. So seeing some of those entirely free elements in Tears of the Kingdom is mind-boggling, especially when you include the fuse ability, where we can take all these different items and mix and match with them to have all these sorts of different effects. And not only can you fuse hundreds of items with others that can lead to thousands of possibilities, but it seems like you can even take some of these fused items and fuse them again based on what we've seen from this footage here. There just seems to be a staggering amount of options. But then let's also consider the Ascend ability. The Ascend ability is not really something we've seen in any other game before. We saw Nintendo make pads about this ability. It's kind of insane when you think about it. Any surface that you can see a ceiling for, you can seamlessly warp through straight up and find yourself at the very top. It's not a loading zone, it's anywhere that you can smoothly dive straight up through and appear right at the top at. It's a pretty crazy mechanic, and we talked about this the other day, but we saw that the Ascend ability actually was lit up and usable when Link was underwater very briefly. This might imply underwater exploration. For more on that, you can check out my video about underwater exploration, but if there's underwater exploration where we can use some of these abilities as well, that further expands the world, and there's a lot of speculation there's also be some underground stuff too. So this world looks to be fairly massive with all these abilities that give us a great degree of interaction with this world that will help it to feel like a living, breathing world that we can make our own. And also, we've seen signs, there are runes we've seen with promotional material that we haven't seen in the game yet. They suggest that there are even more abilities. What are these abilities? Are there even more ways we can interact with the world in Tears of the Kingdom that we don't know about? That might be the case. So when you consider all these gameplay mechanics, and you consider the draw distance and just how explorable this massive world is, I would say together that leads to something pretty impressive technically. However, as I noted earlier, this game, from what we've seen, might not look as impressive graphically than Breath of the Wild, because it might be trying to run a much larger world. Of course, when we take a look at the press release screenshots, when we take a look at the trailers, in terms of sharpness and texture detail, it does actually match up to Breath of the Wild, if not being slightly better, so I'm hoping that it's just compression that's impacting this. But there are some other things I've noticed. So in this footage here, as I'm going to point out, there is this texture filtering that we can see that's pretty obvious. As Link progresses, you can see a line of detail that changes. This is something that we saw in Breath of the Wild that was also pretty obvious, and here in Tears of the Kingdom, it's looking to be pretty obvious too. So either A, that's just saying it's going to be there, or B, this is an early build of the game that may not be as apparent when we play the game finally. But that is something I have to consider here. It's something that I was hoping they would improve upon over Breath of the Wild, but from the demonstration, it hasn't been improved upon. So we'll see on that with the final build. But I do speculate that if this is not a compression issue, and maybe they're just relying on a dynamic resolution, maybe it's a little fuzzier in places to make sure there's a solid frame rate throughout, I would say that's important, because people complain about the frame rate issues in Breath of the Wild. So if Tears of the Kingdom manages a solid frame rate alongside this massive world with this huge draw distance and all these gameplay mechanics, I would say that that's technically impressive. And if they somehow manage all this while looking how the game has looked in the trailers and the press release screenshots, I would say this game is very technically impressive. But if it turns out this blurriness is not just compression and it's the game looking a little bit blurrier or less detailed with some of its textures compared to Breath of the Wild, then I'll concede that there's some level of disappointment there, but when you factor in everything else that they're doing, I would still say it's overall more impressive. But I'm optimistic, it's just compression, as I've said for like the 20th time in this video. So my take is that Tears of the Kingdom, when you consider it all, is technically impressive. But I do understand where some people may be coming from, how it looks very samey to Breath of the Wild. And if you just took a look at the beginning footage where they just focused on Hyrule, if you weren't paying attention to the subtle details, it may look pretty much the same to you, and you may not want the same. So I can kind of understand how some people may perceive that, but I think that Tears of the Kingdom actually has a lot going on that they're not showing us yet, and I think the abilities they've shown us are actually pretty mind-boggling, that give us an amazing amount of gameplay possibility, and I think we are looking at a very, very impressive game, but once we get our hands on it, that will become even more telling. Anyways, everyone, those are my thoughts on the matter. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.